Poria, Moumni and Cassandre Bouvier became friends in Paris while studying at the Sorbonne. The girls were passionate about the cultures of other countries, especially Latin America, so they studied the history, social and political movements, and culture of the region. Poria, who was born in Morocco, was 24 years old. After completing her thesis on Argentina, she decided to put aside her books and visit the country she had written about. Cassandra, at the age of 29, was no stranger to traveling the world, so she gladly accepted her friend's invitation. The girls packed their suitcases and embarked on a journey through the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean basin. In July 2011, the friends arrived in Salta. It is a province located in the northwest of Argentina with a very interesting geographical, social, and historical repertoire. The landscapes ranged from snow-capped peaks in the Western Plains with a tropical dry climate in the east. The architecture includes churches and cathedrals built during the colonial period, ideal for exploration and study by curious students. However, it is worth noting that, like many provinces in the north of the country and probably throughout Latin America, Salta maintains conservative customs. The influence of the Catholic Church on people's daily lives is significant, and the differences between social classes are pronounced. Politics is controlled by a few influential families who have held power for decades. It is important to mention that as this story unfolds, things will become clearer shortly. On July 15th, Cassandra and Horia checked into a hotel in Salta and set out to explore the sites without unpacking their belongings, as they planned to return to Buenos Aires. Salta is a popular province among tourists, known for its low crime rate and friendly population, especially towards tourists. The main attraction in Salta is the natural reserve called Quebrada de San Lorenzo. At exactly 16:23 on July 15th, the girls purchased tickets to visit the reserve. They decided not to hire a guide and ventured deep into the forest. From Buenos Aires, they were supposed to contact their families and inform them of the next city they planned to visit. However, no word was heard from them. On the 19th, unable to bear the uncertainty, their families reached out to Cassandra and Horia's acquaintances in Argentina and asked them to contact the police. 2 weeks later, a group of tourists from a neighboring town embarked on the same trail as the French girls. They arrived at the reserve quite late in the evening, but it was not unusual in this area. Around 1800 hours, one of the tourists separated from the group to find a secluded spot in the dense undergrowth. There, he noticed something resembling a body. Approaching and confirming that it was indeed a body, he screamed and rushed back to the group to inform them of his discovery. The police arrived at the reserve around 10 p.m. The tourists had not marked the exact location where they found the body, only mentioning that it was near a viewpoint. Therefore, in the darkness and amidst the dense vegetation, the police initially struggled to locate it. Eventually, they found the body, but before they could begin their work, they discovered 2 more victims just a few meters away. It turned out to be the 2 missing French tourists. The police developed several theories, including the possibility that the girls were accidentally shot by a local hunter, as many residents in the area hunt for food. Therefore, the search focused on local residents. The police arrested Francisco Tejeda, who worked as a horseback riding guide for tourists. However, he was released just a few days later as there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. His wife told the press that her husband was arrested solely because they were poor people. The police needed a scapegoat to appease public opinion. Immediately after the discovery of the bodies, the police shared with the press that they had been lying in the forest for about 3 days. Since the girls had kept their tickets to the reserve for the 15th, various theories arose about what could have happened to them during the remaining days when they were reported missing. It was speculated that they might have been kidnapped, held captive somewhere, and then disposed of. However, the police later clarified that the girls were killed 14 days prior, and they had been lying in the reserve near the viewpoint all that time. Due to Cassandra's torn clothing and Uria's pants and underwear being pulled down to her knees, speculations about violence against the girls emerged. The autopsy confirmed this. The tourists were severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot with a .22 caliber firearm. In the reserve, the police found a corresponding shell casing. They concluded that the girls had managed to take a walk and returned to the entrance of the reserve. There were few visitors at that time, the sun was setting, and the weather was not conducive to late walks. Obviously, it was then that the perpetrator or perpetrators approached their victims, with one attacker assaulting Cassandra. After the violence inflicted upon her, the girl was shot in the head while kneeling before her killer. Uriah, who witnessed Cassandra's murder, decided not to give up too easily. A clump of hair remained in her clenched fist, indicating her struggle with at least one assailant. Then, according to investigators' assumptions, the girl dashed down the slope from the height when she was caught by a bullet. It hit her in the back, passing through her shoulder. The culprits left, believing that Uriah was also finished. However, she was still alive and attempted to crawl back to the trail. Nevertheless, her attempts were unsuccessful as she was too weak and endured several more hours of agony before succumbing to blood loss. The investigators examined the girl's hotel room and found only one phone among their belongings, instead of the expected two. By determining the location of Uriah's phone, they discovered that a local girl named Maria Fernanda Canizares, the daughter of a former police officer, was using it. They also found Uriah's camera in her possession. The girl claimed that these were gifts from her boyfriend, Gustavo Lossi. Gustavo, 23 years old, worked as a guide in the reserve, and his father sold tickets to tourists. It was Gustavo who had offered his services to the French girls, but they declined. Gustavo had changed the SIM card in the phone, thinking that would be enough to avoid detection. Not immediately, but Gustavo Lossi confessed to being present at the crime scene and participating in the violence. However, he claimed that he was not the instigator or the killer of the French girls, but merely a witness. He recounted that upon hearing noise and running to the screens, he witnessed two men, 24-year-old Daniel Vilt, a stonemason, and 31-year-old Santos Clemente Vera, a gardener from the San Lorenzo plain, tormenting the girls. Supposedly, these men coerced him into participating in the violence and then allowed him to leave. However, he didn't forget to take the girl's phone and camera with him. However, during a search of Gustavo's home, the police discovered the weapon that fired the fatal shots. Uriah's camera helped the police establish the exact time of the attack on the French girls. The girls were enjoying sightseeing and took several photos just before embarking on a hike through the reserve. 2 hours and 5 minutes later, at 6:28 p.m., the tourists took their last photo, which turned out blurry and unclear, allowing investigators to speculate that the attack occurred precisely at that moment. All three men were charged with murder. Witnesses immediately came forward, pointing to Vilt as the person who attempted to sell a rifle. However, he had a solid alibi as he was at a bank during the time of the attack and could prove it. In 2014, Gustavo Lossi was sentenced for 30 years in prison, while Vera was released due to insufficient evidence and his denial of guilt. He also claimed to have an alibi. However, the prosecutor demanded a review of the case, and in 2016, both men were sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed that one of the most high-profile cases in Argentine history had reached its conclusion. But no, the story doesn't end there. French journalist Jean-Charles Chattard dedicated 4 years to his own investigation of this case and wrote a book presenting his arguments as to why the girls couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve on July 15, as the investigators claim. The journalist is convinced that the girls didn't die in the reserve, their bodies were simply brought there after the murder. Firstly, even after a short walk in the reserve, his shoes were covered in dust and dirt, unlike the victim's shoes. The girls couldn't have taken such a path, then endured violence, fought for their lives, and still had clean shoes. Secondly, the appearance of the tourists, in general, was strange. Their clothing was more suited for an evening event in the city rather than a hike in the nature reserve. The next strange thing is that the bodies lay in Quebrada de San Lorenzo for 2 weeks. The reserve is a wild, open area inhabited by pumas, foxes, and condors. After such a period, the police could have found completely gnawed bones. However, the bodies were discovered without a single bite mark, not to mention that they were lying in a popular reserve near a frequently visited viewpoint. Finally, the pathologist who examined the bodies confidently stated that they were killed 3 to a maximum of 5 days before the autopsy. Regarding the date of the murders, the doctor is categorical and indicated in the report that it was July 26, 2011. Remarkably, the judge who led the investigation changed this date to July 15th. Could it be possible that the judge intentionally manipulated the facts to protect someone? Could the judge intentionally tamper with evidence? Was he trying to protect someone? This is exactly what Nestor Piccolo, the commissioner in charge of the investigation, was convinced of, and it may have cost him his life. Commissioner Piccolo died under mysterious circumstances 4 months after the start of the investigation. He was found at the entrance of the commissioner's office with a bullet in his head. His mother stated that it was her son's decision, but she is certain that he was killed, and it was an execution. No traces of gunpowder were found on Nestor's hands, and before his death, he was working on a new version. According to Clemente Vera, he is innocent, and Gustavo Lossi is simply an accomplice of the real criminals, representatives of the upper classes of the province. Nicholas's investigation worried many people who wanted to hide the truth, including the judge. And the influential local families could not allow the light to be shed on the deaths of the French girls. However, this conspiracy of silence was interrupted in April 2014 by an anonymous letter describing the same trail that Commissioner Piccolo was investigating. The letter was sent to the victims' families in France. Chattard received a copy of it and pursued this lead. The anonymous letter was handwritten by a woman who chose not to sign it out of fear of testifying in court. Chattard spent several months, but eventually found a witness. It turned out to be a girl who is often in the company of a small circle of influential individuals in Salta. She knew that on July 15, 2011, the 2 tourists couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve because they were invited to a party organized by the city's wealthy youth. She paints a completely different picture of what happened. At such parties, alcohol flows freely and everything resembles a movie, but it's all happening in real life. According to the girl, Cassandra and Uriah were among the guests and were seen near the pool. As the evening progressed and more drinks were consumed, the men became increasingly interested in the attractive French women. Around 3 a.m., they led them inside the house, and no one saw them after that. The guys started harassing one of the tourists. Of course, she refused, but her opinion no longer mattered to the men, and things went too far. Her friend witnessed what happened, so the guys decided to kill both of them to prevent the truth from being revealed. However, they didn't rush. They tortured the victims for several days before finally killing them. The witness provided the exact location where this supposedly happened, a villa in the most fashionable district of the city, Buena Vista, where deputies, ministers, and wealthy foreigners reside. The villa is usually not occupied permanently as it is often rented out for private parties. There is also a pool, which is where the French women were last seen. But the most intriguing part is the villa's location, right beneath where the bodies were found. Behind the house, there is a hidden path leading to the lookout point of the nature reserve. If everything happened as the witness claims, the bodies of the girls were carried under the cover of night, taken through that path, and left in the dense undergrowth of the reserve. However, how could such a wild scenario, unfolding at a party in plain sight, remain a secret for so long? The witness claims that it can be explained by the terror imposed by the real criminals on anyone who dares to speak up. According to her, the party was organized by the son of a deputy who attacked the French woman. When she tried to escape, he severely beat her, 2 other sons of the politician were also involved in the assault and later in the murder. Today, the deputy's face calmly looks down from numerous billboards during his latest election campaign. By the way, one of his sons followed in his father's footsteps and became a politician as well. The politician refused to comment on these allegations, but one judge who presided over the initial investigation showed a great interest in the story described in the anonymous letter. He believes that it contains everything necessary to achieve justice. However, the judge who took over the case afterward had no intention of seeking other culprits. He believes that the family must be very influential to manipulate the police, and he attributes the deaths of the French women to the provincial justice system. The new version gives more weight to the witness's story, according to which he saw the 2 French women leaving the nature reserve on July 15. This means that the crime could have occurred in a different place and at a different time than what the investigators insist on. As for the blurred photographs supposedly taken during the attack in the nature reserve, Cassandra's father, Jean-Michel Bouvier, submitted the photo to an expert who believes that it has been manipulated using a photo editing program. The angle of the shot and the lighting cannot be as depicted in the photograph. In France, the victims' families no longer expect anything from the justice system. Jean-Michel Bouvier conducted an independent DNA analysis on his daughter's body. DNA from Gustavo Lossi and 2 other male individuals, as well as 1 female DNA, were found on the most intimate parts. There was no trace of Clemente Vieira's sample. The ownership of the other samples remains unknown, raising questions about the identities of the other individuals involved in the attack on the girls and the true role of Gustavo Lossi. Meanwhile, in the heart of San Lorenzo, a few hundred meters from the place where Cassandra and Uriah's bodies were found, there still stands the modest home of Clemente Vieira's parents. After their son's arrest, they struggle to make ends meet as they are unable to work the land or care for animals in their advanced age. Clemente's parents, his wife, and many local residents believe in his innocence. They believe that his only fault is living close to the crime scene and not having the means to afford lawyers. It is especially sad considering that nothing in the case files connects him to the crime. He claims that the police beat him, that threatened him and his child, demanding a confession to the murder. When he refused to comply, they ransacked his house in search of any incriminating evidence, but they were unsuccessful. In connection with this, in 2017, Santos Clemente Vieira filed a complaint with the Supreme Court of Argentina, and in June 2020, he was granted permission for a case review. He hopes that a new trial will be conducted, during which he will be acquitted. Interestingly, Cassandra's father is convinced of his innocence. He witnessed all the hearings, traveled to Argentina multiple times to learn the details of the case, and conducted his own investigation, concluding that Vieira did not commit the crime. Therefore, he visited Vieira in prison, apologized to him, and then started a social media campaign for his release. Bouvier is concerned that the case review is taking an endlessly long time, while an innocent person continues to sit in prison in Salta. On November 25, 2013, on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a monument was solemnly unveiled in memory of Cassandra and Uriah. Alfredo Garzon, a sculptor from Salta who lived in Paris, responded to Jean-Michel Bouvier's request to take on this work. By depicting an outstretched hand, eyes, and the face with an anguished expression, Alfredo managed to create a very powerful image conveying the pain, horror, and suffering that the girls went through. The sculpture is located in the San Lorenzo ravine, where the victims' bodies were found. Late spring of 1995, Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists where lovers go to enjoy the sunset, an ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and call for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world, declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to 125,000 euros. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received 475,000 euros. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports, and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. She pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statements she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel, and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, the task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man? The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive. The car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to help Mark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests, but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service. In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23 and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schuett was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, while hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand and couldn't hold onto her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car. Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Van Ber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to 115,000 euros. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, the young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Van Ber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured. and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However,
she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to 475,000 euros. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schlitt. The two reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Mark's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Mark were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Mark with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Mark never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Mark's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, but the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Mark's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 kilometers per hour. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. It is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all, since theoretically he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Mark Van Ver did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Mark suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, He died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail. Mark hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed two almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Van Ba family would never have suspected her of anything.
In 2016, a suburban train was moving along its usual route towards Berlin when suddenly one of the passengers felt unwell. Unfortunately, it was not possible to save him, and the 37-year-old man passed away due to heart failure. Despite the sorrowful nature of his death, he died of natural causes. However, his departure from life triggered a chain of events that led to the resolution of a case that had remained a mystery for 23 years. The German town of Bad Belzig, which was simply known as Belzig until 2010, is located 70 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Today, it is home to 11,000 people. Bad Belzig is considered a historic town because it houses the medieval fortress of Eisenhart Castle, Burg Eisenhart, first mentioned in a document from the year 997, issued by Emperor Otto III, which is quite impressive. Apart from the castle, one of the main attractions of the town is the thermal complex called Stein Therm, where families and groups of friends often gather on weekends for leisure and relaxation. Overall, Bad Belzig appears to be an excellent town for family living. Among the families who settled in the town was the family of Andrea Lohagen. Andrea, her sister, as well as their parents Rosemarie and Freddie, lived on the outskirts of the city in a new residential complex. Andrea was born on January 6, 1977, and by 1993 had grown into an attractive 16-year-old girl. Andrea was in the 11th grade and eagerly awaited finishing school. As one of the top students in her class, she felt confident about her future studies at the university. She was a responsible, intelligent, serious, well-read girl, yet sociable and friendly. Everyone who knew her sincerely loved her. On Thursday, October 7, 1993, there were only 2 school days left before the holidays. Naturally, Andrea was looking forward to the upcoming vacation, shopping, parties, and meetings with friends. On that day, her parents decided to spoil their daughter and took her to a large shopping center where they bought Andrea a pair of platform shoes and Levi's jeans she had been eyeing for a while. At 6 o'clock in the evening, when they returned home, Andrea, as usual, turned on the music cassette of her favorite band, Alphaville, and began selecting what to wear with her new items. Of course, she was in high spirits. Indeed, like any teenager, she couldn't wait to show off her new outfit to her friends that same evening. And Andrea knew the ideal place to reach as large an audience as possible for this. After dinner, around 8 o'clock in the evening, Andrea called her friend to arrange a walk, but she was already in Potsdam. Pogo was the name of the local club where teenagers like to gather. As it often happens with clubs in small towns, it was conveniently located equidistant from the homes of local families, and Andrea and her friends were regular visitors. Pogo was a 15-minute walk from her home, and considering the short distance, the girl often walked instead of waiting for the bus. She hadn't learned to drive a car yet. Moreover, in a small town, she felt safe walking alone in the evening, and her parents were not afraid to let her go out alone. Besides, in the evening, the likelihood of not meeting anyone on the way was higher than encountering someone unfriendly. So, on October 7th, as always, Andrea decided to walk, first asking her parents for permission to leave for a few hours. They agreed, asking her to return no later than 10 o'clock.
Andrea agreed without argument and left home at 8 o'clock in the evening. That evening, as always when their daughter left home, her parents stayed awake, expecting Andrea. But when the clock struck 10 in the evening, the girl hadn't returned home. At first, the parents thought she was caught up socializing with friends and either forgot about the time or didn't manage to leave the club on time. They waited a little longer, constantly peeking out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of their daughter. An hour passed, then a second, but it grew later, and Rosemary and Freddie became increasingly worried. What troubled them particularly was that Andrea was one of the best students in her class, which meant she knew she had to go to school the next day. Therefore, it seemed unlikely for her to intentionally stay out late. It was completely out of character for her because she was a very responsible girl who always came home on time and listened to her parents. Complicating matters was the fact that in 1993, teenagers didn't have mobile phones. Andrea couldn't write or call her parents if she was delayed, and they couldn't find out her whereabouts. By 12:30, unable to contain their worry, the parents began calling her friends, hoping that perhaps she stayed the night at one of their places, as they were closer. But of course, that wasn't the case. No one knew where she was. At 1 o'clock in the morning, driven mad by worry, her father Freddie decided to look for her himself. He drove several times along the road she should have taken to the club, went through other, more remote streets, but he couldn't find his daughter. Shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning, he went to the police station and reported his daughter missing. He probably hoped that the police would act immediately because several hours had passed since she was supposed to return home, but he was mistaken. Officers believed it was too early to take any action. Although this was extremely upsetting and disappointing for the girl's parents, those were the rules. The police often receive reports of missing persons, especially when it involves a teenager, and they prefer to wait a day before taking action because teenagers usually return on their own the next morning. On the other hand, how many reports of missing teenagers could the police get in the town of 11,000 people? Besides, Andrea wasn't a problematic teenager. She had no reason to run away. No conflicts at home or with friends. Andrea was a happy girl who had just returned from shopping. The holidays were near, and she was allowed to hang out and enjoy her youth with friends. Her parents were convinced that Andrea wouldn't have run away, but the fact remained. For Rosemary and Freddie, this must have been a real nightmare. Sitting at home, unable to rest, fearing for their daughter's life, constantly imagining scenarios of what might have happened to her, knowing that nobody was even looking for her. On the following day, January 8th, Andrea's mother, Rosemary, also attempted to search for her daughter independently. It's understandable that waiting for the police to take action might have been a real torment. She walked through the town center and along the path Andrea was supposed to take. About 100 meters from the Pogo Club, she noticed a wooded area. Interestingly, this plot belonged to the grandfather of Andrea's former boyfriend, a boy a little older than her, from whom she had parted ways just a few weeks before her disappearance. While exploring this area, the girl's mother stumbled upon a hut where she found a mattress and a hand towel lying around. At that moment, surrounded by trees and hearing only the barking of dogs, she suddenly felt very uncomfortable, almost physically sensing that something was amiss. Suspicion crept into her mind that Andrea's former boyfriend might have something to do with her disappearance, and she would continue to believe this for a long time. Convinced that detectives should inspect this area, she reported it to the police, but once again, they did nothing. They explained that they didn't see any reason or concrete evidence to investigate this territory. It was unclear where the evidence could have come from if they hadn't started their work yet. Perhaps they should have looked for clues in the hut. Nevertheless, they clarified to Rosemary that they didn't have a warrant, meaning they couldn't legally go there. Only a week after the teenager's disappearance did the police finally begin their work. Law enforcement checked hospitals and transportation, leaving Bag Belzig, the place where Andrea could have departed from. Helicopters flew over the forests of the town for several days, while ground search teams, including dog handlers, scoured the area. Dog handlers searched the route between the girl's home and Pogo and examined the surrounding areas. To precisely establish Andrea's last actions, detectives interviewed all possible witnesses, everyone present at Pogo on that evening. However, it proved quite challenging, as the police had waited for an entire week and teenagers frequented Pogo every day. They were now confused about the specific day and couldn't accurately confirm if they had seen Andrea at the club on October 7th. Fortunately, after speaking with 21-year-old Yvonne Eshkin, a club employee, They were able to confirm that Andrea was there on the 7th. Yvonne remembered seeing Andrea standing outside the club. While she couldn't recall the exact time, it was definitely before 10 p.m. because Pogo closes at 10 p.m. Other witnesses remembered seeing Andrea walking along a dark road towards the club. Another witness reported seeing her talking to two boys. The police questioned 13-year-old Robin and 14-year-old David, who confirmed exchanging a few words with Andrea as she was returning from the club, after which she went home while the boys went in the opposite direction. The police began to suspect that Andrea might have taken an isolated narrow path that would have been plunged into complete darkness at that late hour. The locals referred to this path as the Lover's Path, located between the homes of two families, which would have allowed the girl to reach home much faster than the main road. However, the police could never confirm whether she indeed took the Lover's Path because neither the canine units nor the forensic experts found any evidence supporting this theory. Nonetheless, this secret path was often used by teenagers returning from the club. To attract more attention to the case, Andrea's photo was shown on television, and a reward of 10,000 marks was offered for information that could help find her. The police asked anyone who could assist them in bringing the girl back home safely to contact them. They received over 250 reports stating that Andrea Lohagen had been seen in various countries around the world: Turkey, Greece, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Spain. However, despite the police's efforts to investigate each lead, none of them led to any breakthroughs. Eventually, the police admitted defeat as they had nothing to work with, and the investigation came to a standstill. The case remained unsolved, and Andrea Lohagen was no longer sought after by anyone other than her family. 7 years later, on July 9, 2000, a local resident was enjoying her morning coffee on a beautiful day when she saw Josie, her landlord's dog, joyfully playing with something resembling a soccer ball. However, upon closer inspection, the woman realized that it wasn't a ball but a human skull. She hurriedly called the police. Soon, Frank Friedrich, the woman's landlord, arrived. Unexpectedly, he claimed that he had already seen the skull, took it from the dog, and hid it before leaving to celebrate his parents' birthday. Upon returning home to address the matter, the police were already there. The man explained his peculiar behavior by stating that he knew that during World War II, prisoners of war were held in that area, so he assumed the skull was quite old. Therefore, he hid it, intending to deal with it later. When the police inspected the area where the skull, presumably that of Andrea, was found by the dog, it turned out to be the very same location warned about by Andrea's mother, just 10 meters behind the Lover's Path and 100 meters from Pogo. Inside a long-abandoned cabin, behind a weathered door simply leaning against the wall, the police found the rest of the skeleton. Thus, if the killer attempted to hide the body, they hadn't put in much effort. Surprisingly, despite the police searching this location with sniffer dogs in 1993, nobody noticed or smelled anything. Journalists, reporters, the landlord's dogs, construction workers, and local residents had visited the site, all departing with the same outcome. Naturally, the locals, convinced the remains belonged to Andrea, were furious at how the police handled the investigation. The police defended their actions, stating they had investigated the area only a week after the girl's disappearance. Supposedly, they had acted very promptly since the police are obligated to search for a missing person, only if there are suspicions of a crime or several weeks after the disappearance. Regardless, the remains were sent to a laboratory, confirming they indeed belonged to Andrea. DNA comparison was unnecessary as the victim's dental records matched the teeth in the skull. Although the girl's remains were found, the forensic expert couldn't determine how she was killed or what happened before her death, as only the skeleton remained. However, he noted a head injury on the skull. Notably, Andrea was found not where the murder occurred. Her clothing wasn't found in the cabin. Even her watch and favorite ring were missing. To this day, it remains unknown whether this implies the victim was assaulted, causing her clothes to be removed, or if they were taken to conceal evidence.
If the latter is true, the perpetrator's actions seem senseless because the body wasn't even hidden. With the discovery of the remains, the case was reopened, but it was now a murder investigation for Andrea Lohagen. At this point, both the police and the townspeople questioned what the motive for the murder could have been. They were especially troubled by the fact that the Lover's Path, near where the body was found, was only known to a limited number of locals, suggesting the killer lived in Bad Belzig and possibly was still among them. However, despite this breakthrough and a reward of €5,000 for any information, the police still lacked substantial leads, leaving the case unsolved for many years. Everything changed in the summer of 2016 when an unknown woman called the police, claiming she precisely knew who killed Andrea Lohaugen, her friend, 37-year-old David. He was one of the two boys who had met Andrea on her way from Pogo. At the time of Andrea's disappearance, David was 14 years old. As an adult, David was a loner who enjoyed solitude, struggled to hold a job due to alcohol and substance abuse issues, and this lifestyle undoubtedly led to health problems. The woman who called the police explained that the reason she decided to share this information was that David had died in the same year, 2016. He was on a train to Berlin when he suddenly fell ill and passed away due to natural causes. It is unknown how long this woman had been holding on to this information. David left no other confessions. The only evidence hinting at his guilty conscience was a dark post on a social media platform. In the photo, a man wearing a shirt with the inscription "Wanted" is seen holding a small child. Underneath the image, he wrote, "You can do the right thing 1,000 times, but make one mistake, and you're worthless." The police tried to learn from David's mother what she knew about the matter, perhaps if her son had confessed to her about the crime. However, she was reluctant to speak with the officers. After all, she still lived in the same town where Andrea went missing, and where her family resided. Eventually, she admitted that her son had told her they and a friend had planned to rob Andrea, but everything went wrong, and Andrea was killed. That was all she knew. The woman who called the police added that at the time of David's murder, he wasn't alone. He was with his then 13-year-old friend, Robin. In 2016, 36-year-old Robin lived in Tyrol, Austria, with his wife and 2 children, worked on a dairy farm, was very quiet, friendly, and spent evenings at home. He was so secretive that his colleagues only learned about his wedding after he decided to change his surname following the marriage. Robin was questioned on October 27, 2016, but since he was 13 years old at the time of the crime, he was questioned only as a witness, not a suspect. Law enforcement couldn't imprison him, even if he confessed to the crime, as he was below the age of criminal responsibility at 13.
Of course, this doesn't seem right. If you understand how to take someone's life, you should be punished in some way. During the conversation, Robin didn't deny David's involvement in the crime, but asked for the opportunity to discuss his own participation after speaking with his family. He was allowed to go home and was given a new date to return to the station for further questioning. However,
police soon realized that Robin's desire to talk to his family wasn't the real reason for refusing to speak with them. It was merely an excuse to leave the station. Indeed, just a few hours after returning home, he left again. But before that, he left a farewell note for his wife. He put on hiking boots, got into the car, and headed towards Pendling Mountain, located approximately 15 kilometers from his home. There, he climbed the mountain and jumped from it. 4 days later, on November 4th, his body was found by a hunter. In the note to his wife, he didn't explain anything, just bid farewell. The police chief later mentioned that when the detectives spoke with Robin, they explained to him that he wouldn't face any problems, no prison sentence. They just wanted to know why he did it. They wanted Andrea's parents to get answers to the questions that had tormented them for so many years. But Robin decided otherwise. It was undoubtedly difficult for Andrea's parents to come to terms with his departure. With his departure, their last chance to find out the motive behind the murder disappeared. What happened just before Andrea's death and how exactly she died. Why they removed her clothes and how long the girl remained alive. Also, where exactly everything happened. However, it's very interesting that the plot where the cabin was located belonged not only to Andrea's former boyfriend, but also to one of the boys' grandfathers. This is because Andrea's ex-boyfriend and Robin were cousins. David and Robin were troublesome teenagers well known throughout the town. They were often seen smoking or drinking alcohol. Soon they embarked on a series of burglaries, after which they served time in juvenile detention. So, it couldn't be said that they were kids whom no one could suspect of anything. But murder is something much more significant than breaking into someone's house and stealing valuable items. Detectives spoke with the boys soon after they, as later revealed, killed Andrea. At that time, they were not suspected of anything. They were just witnesses. But one can't help but wonder, if you're 13 or 14 years old and you've just committed murder, how composed will you be when the police come questioning you? The detective who interacted with them in 1993 recalls that they were calm and rational. However, they asked various strange questions, like what it's like to be in juvenile detention as a murderer. Additionally, when the detective went to one of the boys' homes, he saw a cassette with inappropriate films on the table. Moreover, when he asked each of the boys to clarify where they met Andrea and which road they took afterward, their statements differed. Nevertheless, the oddities in the boys' behavior and the discrepancies in their statements were not sufficient to accuse them of anything. Certainly, there are many cases where investigators did not hesitate to pressure teenagers and interrogate them for hours on end in pursuit of a confession, but not in this case. Perhaps the police didn't want to interrogate and pressure David and Robin for long, considering their age. Although the police officially closed the case, Andrea's parents are not convinced. They suspect that a third person was involved in the murder. Freddie, the girl's father, couldn't believe that two young boys committed such a heinous crime without the help, guidance, or at least the influence of an adult or someone older than them. Rosemary and Freddie are convinced that they had assistance. Andrea's mother's intuition has proven right before. What if her intuition isn't wrong this time? It was a completely senseless and cruel murder, and even before the killer's death, they did not alleviate the suffering of the victim's parents. Shortly before Andrea's death, she wrote an essay titled The Tale of Happiness. Andrea narrated an encounter with an old man who told her, "I worry about you because you seem so sad." He promised to grant her 3 wishes. The first was a journey at 16, and the second was a happy future. Andrea, being prudent, didn't want to waste the third wish, explaining, "Who knows what will come after, as I am already happy." However pitiful an existence the killers might lead, even if they remembered the crime they committed every day, they could move on. But for Andrea, who loved life so much, hers was taken away. November 4th, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions, whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Fotopoulos family's house. In the bedroom on the second floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Fotopoulos, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the second floor. 26-year-old Lisa Fotopoulos was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital, and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber. Saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the first floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Costa Fotopoulos grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him.
a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business, a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her, her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, it was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Deidre Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Deidre turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Deidre was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, he became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, the girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deirdre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deirdre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deirdre 2 blocks away from her work so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, the bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening for some unknown reason. Furthermore, she recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Fotopoulos' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Fotopoulos' bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the Fotopoulos house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt, but if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet.
Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at CoStar's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering, but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, they asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The poor boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him, but that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and the .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Fotopoulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during Kostar's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under Kostar's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, the judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her. Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life, not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear at the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Pena, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa, drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertmann woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth's or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Pena family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Pena family home. They did just that. Randy Ertmann and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Pena family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Pena. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, the families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house. He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertmann was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertmann and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medin, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medin, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul the Ariel. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless. After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medin and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl, where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medai and watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry. She was more in anger. However, seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medin watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girl's shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Cantu always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse. It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, she told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venanzio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venanzio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Pena believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughter's torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor? Do you want him living next to you?" Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Ertman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities. A woman walking or running alone on a trail. This image is often associated with a dense forest, where a thin, winding path leads deeper into it, and rays of light barely penetrate through the thick tree canopy. It's a place where an unsuspecting victim could be dragged off the trail, and nobody would hear her scream. But what if it's a sun-drenched, highly popular pathway located right in the heart of the city, where people stroll almost at any time? The attack on Katie Lorek happened precisely in such a wonderfully safe place. And that's the scariest part, because it confirms that a nightmare can become a reality in an instant. And something like this could happen to any one of us. Kathleen Louise Ayello Lorek, known as Katie, was born in New Mexico but grew up in California, where she met her future husband, Jeffrey Lyon. The young couple got married and they had 3 children, but despite 20 years together, the family eventually fell apart. Their divorce was a challenging process and was officially finalized in 1997. However, it turned out to be beneficial for the 44-year-old woman. Her friend recalls that Katie had always been a lively person, but after the divorce, she simply blossomed. Over the next 3 years, Katie advanced in her career, working as an assistant in Sistren Donner in Concord, California. It was a very successful and prominent company, and Katie held a high position in the office. A new, wonderful chapter began in her life. Her children were almost grown, she loved her job, and she started dating again. Despite being over 40, due to her excellent physical condition, grooming, and joyful attitude toward life, she attracted a lot of attention. At work, Katie introduced her son to one of her colleagues. The man's name was Johannes Lorek. There was an instant spark between them, and with Johannes, Katie felt she could be herself. They started dating, although their meetings were not very frequent because Johannes lived in Austria. However, they traveled together, had romantic weekends, and enjoyed skiing. In 2003, during a trip to a lake in Switzerland where they had gone for a skiing excursion, Johannes knelt down and asked Katie to marry him. She would have been happy to spend the rest of her life with Johannes, and just a few weeks later he came to the United States and they got married. The couple planned to live in Austria. After all, there was nothing truly tying the woman to the States. Her sons and daughter had grown up and supported her new relationship. Everyone who knew Katie wanted her to be happy, and it seemed like everything was heading that way in her marriage to Johannes. Meanwhile, Katie worked her last few weeks at the company, where her colleagues had practically become her family members. She was always ready to help her colleagues, genuinely concerned about each one of them, and was highly appreciated for it. However, no matter how open and caring Katie was, even she needed a breather. Her respite became the daily walks along a trail that started behind the parking lot of her office. During every lunch break, she would put on comfortable sport shoes and stroll along a trail slightly over 20 kilometers long. The Contra Costa Canal Trail passes through several residential neighborhoods, offices, and is surrounded by moderately dense but perfectly suitable greenery for walks. Besides enjoying the fresh air, Katie valued this time because she could make personal calls, especially to her husband. In Austria, it was around 9 o'clock in the evening, making it comfortable for the spouses to communicate. So, on Tuesday, May 13, 2003, colleagues saw Katie as usual at 12:40 p.m. She kicked off her office shoes, put on her sneakers, and left the office, just as she did every weekday. One might think that taking a solitary walk along a trail amidst shrubbery could be risky for an attractive woman, and in case of any danger, nobody would hear her scream. But this specific trail was nothing like that. Not only did it pass by residential homes and businesses, but people were constantly walking, jogging, walking dogs, and biking along it. It was nearly impossible to find a time during midday when the trail was deserted, yet someone managed to do so. Katie was deeply engaged in a conversation with her husband when he heard her either muffle a scream or sharply inhale before the phone disconnected. Johannes tried calling his wife back, assuming she might have simply stumbled and dropped her phone, but all calls went to voicemail. He knew Katie would call back, understanding that her abrupt end to the conversation might worry him, so he called her office to alert her colleagues. By that time, they were already concerned. Katie was punctual to the minute, and when she didn't return after lunch, they began searching for her. Johannes's call further troubled them. They knew what needed to be done. It was around 3 p.m. when the police were notified of Katie Lorek's disappearance. Credit must be given to the police. They didn't take the disappearance of an adult woman lightly and responded promptly. Just a few minutes after the call to the police, they dispatched officers to the trail since colleagues mentioned she should be there. The officers searched for her on foot, on motorcycles, and called in K9 units. The dog indeed led the K9 unit in the same direction the missing woman used to enjoy walking, so the officers knew they were on the right track. But how could she simply vanish in broad daylight? The search quickly led the K9 unit to a bloody trail on the pathway. It wasn't just a few drops, it was a very distinct trail, as if an injured person had been dragged from the trail into the bushes, but that wasn't all they found. A sneaker caught their eye, lying nearby in a pool of blood. Then they saw the body of a woman lying in the mud. She was in a small depression, covered in blood, her hair matted with it. She was naked, with a bra featuring an animal print lying on the grass nearby, along with black leggings, another sneaker, and a jacket. It seemed as though someone had forcibly removed items of clothing from the victim in a hurried manner. It was evident to the officers that the attack had turned violent, a brutal assault on an unprotected woman. Police immediately checked for signs of life in Katie, and despite all the injuries, it turned out she was still alive. The arriving paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital within minutes. Her condition was extremely fragile, and they were determined to help her. But at 4:54 p.m., they were compelled to pronounce Katie Lorek deceased. Once Katie was taken to the hospital, the forensic specialists aimed to preserve as much evidence as possible, but it was already too late. When it was discovered that Katie was still alive, the medical team worked urgently to save her life, and therefore, they couldn't act cautiously to preserve evidence. They cannot be blamed. It's essential to prioritize saving the life of the victim in such cases. Consequently, some evidence was compromised. However, the police almost immediately discovered something crucial: the weapon used in the crime. It turned out to be a part of a fence post. It was taken from the section of the barrier that had long been rusted. They surmised that whoever the perpetrator was, they had broken off a part of the post just before the attack. Perhaps the crime was impulsive rather than planned, therefore nobody paid attention to the strange object in the assailant's hands as it seemed harmless. While Katie was on the phone with her husband, she didn't see someone approaching or running up behind her. The attacker repeatedly struck her on the head. At least one blow must have caused her to weaken or lose consciousness, preventing her from screaming, and the assailant had the opportunity to drag her into the bushes without resistance. The murder weapon was covered in blood and was found next to the pool of blood where Katie was discovered. The forensic expert concluded that Katie died from head injuries. However, before that, the killer spent quite some time with her, committing various acts of violence. He left his semen on her body and skin particles on the murder weapon, which allowed the experts to retrieve his DNA. The DNA was cross-checked with the database, but there were no matches. After spending 2 hours at the crime scene, officers realized something was missing. Katie was on the phone during the attack. So where was her phone? It turned out the phone was on, and a ping led the police to an apartment building where 23-year-old Juan Sanchez lived. However, if investigators thought they would quickly arrest the suspect and close the case, it wasn't so simple. The young man explained that he was biking on the trail when he stumbled upon the phone without its owner nearby, so he assumed it was okay to take it. Juan showed the police where he found the gadget, and it was right near the crime scene. His words were trustworthy but not entirely convincing. He was asked to provide a DNA sample, and he readily agreed. Preemptively, it soon became clear that Juan was telling the truth. His DNA did not match the sample. He had merely found the victim's phone and was not the killer. However, since DNA comparison was going to take some time, the police delved into Katie's life. In such a fierce attack, the perpetrator is usually someone known to the victim, especially if the victim is a woman. First and foremost, detectives focused on Katie's ex-husband. What if the woman's second marriage had triggered jealousy and rage in him? However, despite the difficult divorce, there were no signs of animosity between the former spouses. Furthermore, Jeffrey had an alibi which ruled him out as a suspect. Before marrying Johannes, Katie was dating another man who lived in Germany, but on the day of the murder, he happened to be in the city due to interesting circumstances. Moreover, Katie had met him just 2 days before her death. Yet again, they couldn't link the man to the crime scene or establish a motive. What if the new man in the woman's life was responsible for her death? It wouldn't be the first time a man didn't want to be tied down by the bonds of marriage, but wasn't content with a divorce either. Usually money becomes a factor, such as insurance. Certainly, Johannes was thousands of kilometers away from his wife and spoke to her on the phone. On the other hand, he knew her schedule better than anyone, knew where she would be and at what time. Could he have hired a hitman? However, the murder weapon indicated that it was a spontaneous, not a planned crime. Besides, a hitman would likely have tried to flee the crime scene as quickly as possible rather than tormenting the woman. Everything suggested that the victim and the killer hadn't been acquainted before the incident. Therefore, detectives doubled their efforts to find witnesses who might have noticed something unusual on the trail that day. People recalled walking there themselves or with their pets, going to work, riding bikes. One cyclist remembered a stranger asking him for a cigarette. Overall, it seemed like an ordinary day, not hinting at anything out of the ordinary. Despite the shock that something like this had happened on the trail where they felt safe every day, a few witnesses remembered a man acting strangely. He was pointing at the canal, showing fish, as if trying to attract the attention of passers-by. 2 unrelated individuals asked to collaborate with an artist and ended up producing 2 remarkably realistic and similar composite sketches of this man. The only difference was the sunglasses that the man had on his head. The composite sketches were publicized in the media, and the public was asked for assistance. This prompted hundreds of calls from people eager to help. Furthermore, a reward was offered for assistance in apprehending the killer, $10,000 promised by the police, along with an additional $25,000 offered by Katie's company. The police compared the composite sketches with photos of local men who had been arrested for displaying aggression. The more they looked, the more they believed they had found a suspect, a man who lived in the area and was known to frequent the trail. He had been arrested for minor offenses and for assaulting a judge. His name was John Kaler, a 32-year-old. John was a mechanic who suffered from several mental health issues. He had several offenses on his record, mostly related to driving under the influence and an impulsive attack on a judge right inside the courthouse. At that time, he was in handcuffs and was immediately pulled away from the judge, but the attack was documented. There were no other aggressive actions.
especially towards women registered against him. However, he was remarkably similar to the composite sketches. Additionally, the search efforts lost track specifically on the street where John lived. The police were convinced that this wasn't just a coincidence and that they had apprehended the killer. They even called Katie's relatives and informed them that they had found the prime suspect. Now, they needed to detain him as carefully as possible. The police arrived at John's father's house where he resided. His sister answered their knock. She confirmed they were at the right address, but John was no longer available to talk. John had died. On May 14th, the day after the investigation began, John went to the Golden Gate Bridge and jumped. The police were allowed to search the house. They found another piece of evidence supporting their theory, a pair of sunglasses identical to those in the composite sketch. They discovered clothing with something resembling bloodstains on it, and in John's room there was a newspaper article about Katie's murder, along with the composite sketches of the suspect. What was the police supposed to think? Could this be a coincidence? It seemed like John had committed the crime, realized the police would be onto him soon, and decided to end everything by going to the bridge. The police were confident that they closed the case within 72 hours. The man's body was in the morgue. All they needed was to take his DNA and compare it to the sample found on Katie Lorek. Witnesses identified John Keller from a photograph as the man on the trail that day. The DNA check became merely a formality. Confident in their righteousness, the officers declared to the media that the case was solved and proclaimed that the cruel murderer and rapist, John Keller, had been identified. Journalists descended upon the man's relatives, demanding answers to their questions and not allowing them to mourn their son and brother peacefully. In response, they criticized the detectives for not waiting for the DNA comparison results. John Keller's sister and father were convinced that the police were mistaken. His father stated that it was irresponsible to connect several random facts and fit them into a picture of the murder. They destroyed the reputation of a young man that was already tarnished. "It's unthinkable," he said. The family was distraught. John could no longer defend himself, and they tried to do it for him. John's father underwent a polygraph test to prove that his son was at home at the time of the crime. The polygraph showed that he was telling the truth. A month passed, Katie was buried, and the police were no longer actively investigating, simply waiting for the DNA test results. And finally, that day arrived. The samples didn't match. John hadn't assaulted or killed Katie. It was a massive blow to the investigators. Not only did they lose a month of investigation, but they also intensified the pain of John's family, who had lost a son and brother. Moreover, even after receiving the DNA test results, they didn't inform the public and only acknowledged the truth after John's father's statements. They stubbornly continued to claim that he might be somehow connected to the case. That's when the Keller family offered their own reward of $5,000 to anyone with information about Katie's murder, because they wanted to clear their son's name once and for all. Police took DNA samples from at least 50 men, acquaintances of Katie or resembling the composite sketch, but no matches were found. Then, after 4 months, a breakthrough occurred in the case. Early in the investigation, when questioning witnesses, one man mentioned that during the time frame the police were interested in, he was biking on the trail and stopped to smoke. A stranger approached and asked for a cigarette. The stranger smoked 2 cigarettes and the cyclist smoked 1. They chatted briefly, and that was the end of it. This happened about 60 meters from where Katie was found. The police decided to follow up on this lead, although it had been a week since the crime. They found a spot with 3 cigarette butts on the ground. Fortunately, they hadn't been rained on, and after 4 months, the DNA comparison result came back. The stranger who asked the witness for a cigarette was the rapist and murderer. But now the challenge was how to find him. The only hope lay in the memory of the cyclist. Miraculously, after 4 months, he recalled that the man worked in the telephone marketing field in a neighboring town. There was only one such company in that town, so armed with composite sketches, because that's all they had. The police went there. Employees immediately recognized 38-year-old Robert Ward Fraser in the images. However, he hadn't shown up for work since May, almost immediately after Katie's body was discovered. They couldn't locate him at his address. His former girlfriend confirmed that he had left a long time ago and presumed he might have returned to his hometown, but she wasn't certain. However, she found something useful for the police: Robert's toothbrush. Again, a DNA test would take time, and it wouldn't hurt to investigate the suspect for the time being.
The man had a history of legal issues, having been arrested 9 times, particularly for robberies and related to illegal substances. He was known for his aggressive behavior in prison. He closely matched the witnesses' descriptions, and an arrest warrant had been issued in Indiana for violating parole conditions. Contacting the Indiana police, the Concord, California officers couldn't believe their luck when they were informed that Robert had tried to return to his hometown and was naturally arrested. Detectives flew from California to Indiana to talk to him. During the interrogation, the man was relaxed, slouched in his chair, joked, and didn't resemble someone afraid of anything. He confirmed that he lived in California, was near the crime scene, and smoked cigarettes with a cyclist around the time of the murder. Robert admitted he heard about Katie Lorek's case on TV, but when the police clarified if he remembered what the woman looked like, he answered that she had long hair, seemed to be a brunette, and guessed that she had freckles. Caught, thought the officers, he provided information that only the killer could have known. Katie did indeed have freckles, but they were not visible in any of the photos shown in the news. The freckles were not on her face, especially since she used makeup, not on her hands, but on the woman's chest. More precisely, between her breasts, meaning only someone who had seen her naked could know about it, and he couldn't have just guessed that. Detectives informed Robert that they had the perpetrator's DNA, to which he started talking about relieving himself in the bushes. In other words, he chose the same spot as the rapist. However, semen was found on Katie, which was an entirely different story. Robert's defense began to crumble, and the detective tried to press him, showing him the bloodiest photo of the victim and asking what she had done to deserve such a thing. Robert claimed he didn't want to see it and that he was not guilty. He sounded quite convincing. The suspect refused to communicate further without a lawyer, but his confession wasn't necessary. His DNA was taken, and it matched the DNA on Katie and on the murder weapon. Witnesses identified Robert as the person they saw on the trail. He was charged with violence, sodomy, and first-degree murder. He faced the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial took place in May 2006. The prosecutor systematically walked the jury through the events of that day. Robert came to the trail with intentions to satisfy his most base desires. He chose Katie because at that moment there were no witnesses on the trail. He grabbed the first weapon he found and attacked the woman, who was talking to her husband on the phone and was unaware of the danger. The prosecutor stated that what we don't know and will never know is how Katie experienced her last moments of life. She is not here with us to tell whether she begged, cried, pleaded for her life, or if she was even conscious after the first blow while the assailant continued to torment her. He then killed the woman, all for a few moments of pleasure. The defense attorneys tried to save the defendant's life, telling the story of his childhood suffering from both physical and psychological violence. However, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. He awaits the execution of the sentence at San Quentin. A tangled love story unfolds like a dark detective tale, a crime film, a film noir, with a timeless plot where lust and obsession lead to murder and classic betrayal. This was Jaime's favorite genre, and he played the lead villain. Patricia helped dress him in the costume of a deranged, jealous man, work overalls, gloves, and a stocking mask. Then she, the true star of this film, brilliantly played the victim. Thirsting for authenticity, she cut her own hand and barricaded herself in the bathroom, clutching a real revolver in her bleeding hand to complete the authenticity of her fabricated image. All that was missing was a camera to focus on her wild eyes and feigned horror as she aimed the revolver and fired. On June 25, 2008, at 1:15 a.m., while the residents of Garden Valley, California were peacefully sleeping in their beds, the fire station received a report of a fire blazing along a winding road above a deep gorge. This is a challenging area with many sharp turns, hills, and ravines. Only upon getting closer did the firefighters notice that a burning SUV was at the center of the fire. Their experience told them that the body of the driver might be inside. Unfortunately, they were right. The body, like the entire vehicle, was completely engulfed in flames. Earlier that evening, a report had been made to the emergency services about a missing resident who had gone to buy propane in his Chevrolet Suburban and had not returned. The firefighters could see that the vehicle burning before them was indeed a Suburban. The missing man was 54-year-old Ron Presba. Around 9 p.m., he had left to buy propane for a barbecue and never returned.
The remains found at the scene were sent for an autopsy, but officers were able to identify the burned vehicle, and it was indeed Ron's SUV. The news quickly spread throughout Garden Valley. Many people knew Ron personally and were saddened by the news. Initially, everything pointed to the man being the victim of a road accident. On such a rough road, there were many opportunities for a vehicle to go off into the ravine and catch fire. The propane Ron was carrying only added fuel to the blaze. Firefighters found 2 large pools of blood, each more than a meter in diameter, on the road. They speculated that the man had hit a deer, a large animal that could cause such a significant amount of blood. It was hard to imagine a worse place to encounter an animal, a dark, winding road above a deep ravine without any guardrails or barriers. Many people in such situations react by sharply turning the wheels. However, the firefighters could not find the body of the struck animal near the collision site. Moreover, upon closer inspection, the bloodstains looked strange. Between the larger pools of blood were smaller bloodstains, as if something was bleeding, then stopped, then started bleeding again. Nearby, there was a partial footprint and some sort of stain, as if a package or something similar had been lying there. Additionally, there were acceleration marks near the scene, indicating that someone had left the scene in a vehicle, and quickly. Considering these strange findings on the road, the fire investigator suspected that this was not an accident. The suspicions of the fire investigator were confirmed when he found a bag with a reddish liquid near the burned-out vehicle. At first, he mistook it for transmission fluid, but it was strangely covered in flies. Upon closer examination, to his horror, he realized that the bag contained hair, skull fragments, and brain matter. The bag had traces of fire, although the flames hadn't yet reached it. This meant that Ron's vehicle had been set on fire before it went off the ravine. It was likely stopped, set ablaze, and then pushed down the slope. The bag was thrown afterward. This was clearly done intentionally. At the coroner's office, it was confirmed that the victim was Ron Presba. The blood on the road and in the bag also belonged to him. Ron had been murdered, and the fire was used to cover up the crime. Police investigators began their work, and the morning after the body was discovered, they spoke with the victim's wife, Patricia, or Patty. Patty seemed overwhelmed with grief, but was eager to help the police. She said that Ron had no enemies. In fact, someone like him couldn't have had enemies. He was one of the pillars of the Garden Valley community. Everyone saw him as a loving father, devoted husband, very honest, hardworking, reliable, and an all-around wonderful person. Ron would give you the shirt off his back to help someone. He had spent many years building his trucking company before he met Patty. Patty worked for the California Conservation Corps and was part of a program that taught young people who would otherwise get into trouble with the law useful labor skills in firefighting, forest protection, and conservation. It was essentially a work camp for troubled youth. Both Patty and Ron had adult children from previous relationships. The day before, at 4:30 p.m., Patty had gone to visit her daughter and grandchildren who lived an hour away. She called her husband around 9 p.m., and he mentioned that he was going to get propane for the barbecue. However, when she returned at midnight, the house was empty. Ron's daughters told the police that a guest had been staying with the family in recent weeks. This guest was 21-year-old Jaime Ramos. Detectives returned to the family home to speak with Patty again. She confirmed that Jaime Ramos had been living with the family for 3 weeks. He was one of the troubled young people assisted by the California Conservation Corps, and Patty had been his mentor. Jaime Ramos had joined the program a year ago after being charged with assault. Patty and Ron decided to help the young man save money so he could visit his relatives in Texas. Patty described Jaime as a nice guy who had faced many challenges since childhood. His mother had taken her own life when he was just 2 years old. His father was in and out of his life, and after being passed around by various relatives, he eventually went to live with his grandmother, who became like a mother to him. Now Patty had taken on the role of his mentor and friend, and Jaime often sought her advice. She explained that Jaime was finishing his training program at the center, but needed a place to stay for the remaining month. Patty had asked Ron if Jaime could stay in their spare bedroom, and Ron, being a kind-hearted person, agreed. Ron welcomed Jaime into their home, and they developed a strong bond, with Ron becoming like a father figure to Jaime. However, just the day before, Jaime had left. They had lent him some money so he could travel to his relatives in Texas. Jaime's sudden departure seemed suspicious, especially since Patty claimed she didn't know how to contact him. In other words, they had lent the young man money, but she had no way to reach him. Before the detectives could ask Patty further questions, something caught their eye. A few drops of blood by the fireplace caught the detectives' attention. Although there weren't many, they deemed it important and called in the forensic team. Upon their arrival, they processed the room with luminol, causing it to light up with traces of blood that someone had attempted to clean. The detectives realized they had stumbled upon the murder scene. Since Patty had an alibi, Jaime seemed the most likely suspect. However, according to Patty, she and Ron had a good relationship with Jaime. Nevertheless, the detectives reached out to Jaime's family in Texas, who said he was still en route but provided his phone number. Over the phone, Jaime confirmed that Ron had become a true friend and mentor to him in a short period. He expressed his desire to help the police uncover the truth about Ron's death. Strangely, though, he refused to disclose his whereabouts. Since Jaime was using a prepaid phone, the police couldn't trace his location. Instead, they tried to gain his trust, encouraging Jaime to keep calling them and persuade him to reveal what he knew about Ron's death. Meanwhile, Curtis Edwards reached out to them. Curtis was also a member of the program helping young people, just like Jaime. Moreover, Jaime was his roommate. Therefore, he knew something that, in his opinion, no one else suspected. Jaime and Patty were having a romance. Curtis was shocked. All the young people in the organization loved Patty, calling her Mom, but Jaime clearly had feelings for her of a different nature. Despite being 21 years old while she was 47, he was younger than her children. Nonetheless, Jaime asked Curtis not to tell anyone about it. As his friend, Curtis agreed, but now he felt obligated to inform the police. The meeting with the detectives was brief, but its importance for the investigation couldn't be underestimated. Because now the investigators knew that Jaime could have a motive for Ron's murder. It was worth talking to Patty again, because it became clear that she knew more than she was saying. Patty reluctantly admitted that she had been involved with Jaime, but a couple of days before Ron's murder, she ended things with her lover because his behavior was increasingly alarming her. When she brought up the breakup, they were in the car, and Jaime swerved the car as if he wanted to crash into an oncoming vehicle. Fortunately, they avoided the accident, but Patty realized he was willing to do anything just to be with her. At some point, Ron realized that his wife was having an affair, but he reacted as a very understanding person. Ron and Patty agreed to buy Jaime a car so he could go to Texas and stop being part of their lives. Patty and Jaime went to a car dealership to choose a car. Patty told the detectives that they bought the car, packed his things into it, and sent him off to Texas. And this happened just before Ron's murder. Now, however, she was afraid that Jaime would come back to finish what he started, to kill her. However, after reviewing the surveillance camera footage at the dealership, detectives found out that the love affair hadn't ended because Patty and Jaime were holding hands and hugging each other affectionately. But before the investigators could summon the woman for a candid conversation, a new twist emerged in the case. Patty disappeared. A month to the day after Ron's murder, the detectives drove back to the same house. Again, they approached the front door, crossed the threshold once more. The feeling of déjà vu never left them, especially when they saw that the small house had become the scene of another bloody crime. Blood was everywhere, in the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, even on the doorstep. Chairs were overturned, rugs were displaced as if something had been dragged across the floor. A bloodied kitchen knife lay on the TV stand. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the bathroom door was broken with bullet holes in it. Everything seemed unreal, like a stage set. Amidst this gruesome scene, the detectives found a note made from cut-out magazine letters. They had never seen such notes before, except in movies. It stated that Patty had been kidnapped, exactly what Patty had feared Jaime would do. The police began their search for the woman and distributed her description to officers. The next day, July 25, 2008, hundreds of kilometers away from the Prespa family home in Salt Lake City, Utah, a patrol officer was checking the registration numbers of cars in a motel parking lot when he noticed a green Hyundai. A quick check revealed that the car was linked to a murder investigation. The officer contacted detectives from California who informed him that two people were associated with this car, Jaime Ramos and Patricia Prespa. Approximately 5 minutes later, the door of the motel room opened and a woman came out. She walked straight to the police officer. He aimed his weapon at her, but the woman stated that she was Patricia Prespa, and she added, "He's in the room, he's been shot." The policeman didn't know what to think and couldn't imagine what he would see when he entered that door. He and his partner burst open the door and shouted, "Police!" But there was no response. Someone was clearly lying on the bed. The policeman demanded that the person raise their hands and come out, but the person didn't move. The officer thought the person under the blanket was dead. He grabbed the blanket and saw that there was a wounded person there.
It was Jaime Ramos. He looked at the policeman and said, raising his hands, "Don't shoot. They've already shot me." Both Patricia and Jaime were taken into custody. While Jaime received medical attention, detectives questioned Patricia. Patty claimed that she also became a victim of Jaime. She recounted that she was sleeping in her bed when suddenly she was grabbed by a man wearing a mask made from a stocking, gloves, and a jumpsuit. She managed to break free, but he lunged at her again. They struggled, wreaking havoc around them. It was only when he dragged her into the kitchen that she realized it was Jaime, although she had never seen him like that before. He confessed to her that he had killed her husband, and she would be next. At one point, Jaime attempted to strike her with a large kitchen knife, slashing her hand as she tried to shield herself. However, she managed to reach the bedroom, grabbed a .44 Magnum revolver, and locked herself in the bathroom. Jaime smashed the door, and that's when she fired 3 times. Dropping the weapon, she ran outside, but even after she shot him 3 times with the Magnum, Jaime caught up with her and seized her. Now he had the gun, and he ordered her to get into his car. They stopped several times along the way, notably to refuel. Detectives puzzled over why she didn't escape from the wounded man while he was refueling the car. Patty replied that she was terrified. What happened next was known to the police. Here, the story could have ended, and Patty would have appeared a heroine. If Jaime had died from the gunshot wounds. He was indeed close to death when they found him in the hotel, but he received timely medical attention and he was ready to talk to the police. When at the age of 21, Jaime was admitted to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he was given a job, he felt like he had hit the jackpot. He quickly befriended other members of the organization, particularly his roommate Curtis, as well as his supervisor Patty. Initially, he regarded her as a friend and mentor, but soon their relationship became much closer. She didn't immediately confess to Jaime that she was married. Even more so, she didn't tell him how 6 years ago she had to work hard to make Ron fall in love with her when her third husband left her. But she told him that she was living in an unhappy marriage. Jaime's heartstrings were deeply touched by Patty's confessions. The thing was, he himself had been tormented by a male relative for years. It started when he was 6. It started when he was 6 years old, ended at 16, and occurred once or twice a month. Jaime asked Patty to leave her husband, but she always found some excuse why it was impossible. Then she mentioned another option. At first it was like a game, a joke. The woman said, "Do you want me to leave him? What if something unfortunate happens to him?" "Which we arrange?" Jaime asked incredulously. "What else?" Patty initiated conversations about how Ron liked to work around the house and might fall from a ladder onto something sharp or get hit by a car. It seemed like a joke until she showed her lover an envelope with insurance. And then he realized that everything they talked about was serious. She convinced him that after receiving the money, they could start over. Jaime would go to college first and they would live together. She took out insurance on her husband and was supposed to receive $150,000 in case of his death. But if his death occurred as a result of an accident, the wife would receive $300,000. This is called double insurance. Double Insurance is also the name of a true classic of cinema, a film in which a woman seduces a man and persuades him to kill her husband, and then the seductress shoots the naive lover. Jaime hadn't watched that movie, but Patty clearly understood its essence. Or Oscar Wilde was right, and life ultimately does imitate art. But Jaime had no intention of becoming a murderer, and Patty started pressing him. "Don't you believe me? Don't you believe that he's tormenting me, beating me? Don't you want to live with me?" She didn't leave the man infatuated with her any other choice. So he set her a condition. He had to personally see what Ron was really like. The woman agreed. She told her husband that a guy at work insulted her, but Jaime stood up for her, beat him, and therefore he was expelled from the program. Now he had nowhere to live. Ron, being a kind soul, of course, offered the guy to stay with them. He personally went for Jaime, brought him home, and thanked him for standing up for his wife. He said that Jaime could live with them for free and only asked him to help around the house, because what the guy did for him was already enough payment. So Jaime started living with his mistress and her husband. Ron behaved friendly, taught him how to use various tools, and in general treated the guy like a son. But Jaime was most concerned that Ron never raised his voice to his wife, never scolded her, never refused her anything, and it clearly wasn't a show for the public. Doubts began to creep into his mind. Patty described a monster, but Jaime saw a completely different Ron. However, Patty wasn't about to back down. She skillfully manipulated the guy, convincing him that he was saving her from a cruel husband, and set a date for when Jaime would have to attack Ron. Otherwise, he would have to leave and never see her again. The thought of this was unbearable for Jaime. Tuesday, June 24th came, one of the longest days of the year. That evening, Ron sat calmly in his armchair by the fireplace watching TV. Patty had indeed gone to her daughter's, but she kept calling her lover, asking if he had finished with her husband yet and why he was taking so long. She insisted that it would be easier to cover up the evidence if it happened outside, so Jaime told Ron that he heard some noise in the pen with his pigs. Ron, of course, believed him and went to check, but Jaime couldn't bring himself to attack the man. When Ron returned home, he sat back in his favorite armchair. Jaime sat on a chair in the kitchen 3 meters away from him and drank a lot of water, as if delaying what he was about to do, trying to calm down. Patty continued to call, asking when everything would be over. Jaime saw the hammer and decided that if one blow to the head rendered Ron unconscious, it would be enough for him. He took one last sip of water, put on gloves, wiped the hammer. The house was so small. Ron was so close. Jaime told himself, "You're doing everything right." He thought about the violence against Patty, remembered how he himself had been abused, and the anger from the flooding memories allowed him to feel a sharp adrenaline rush. He literally jumped up from the chair, ran to Ron, and struck the man 3 times quickly on the head. Ron barely had time to scream, "Why?" But Jaime seemed to snap. He shouted, "How dare you torment my wife? Yes, Patty is my wife now. How dare you hit her?" He struck the man 3 more times, smashing his skull. Then he dropped the hammer. Amazingly, he felt relieved, knowing that he did it for her. But to do everything as she wanted, the killer had to take the body out of the house and create the appearance of an accident. To put Ron in the driver's seat, he had to build a mini-trap from the ladder and plywood. After that, Jaime sat next to the deceased and directed the car towards the cliff, sitting next to the bloodied man whose head he had just smashed. To distract himself from such a reality, he remembered the movie Sin City. There's a scene where a killer drives down a deserted road with a corpse sitting next to him. But when Jaime watched that movie 3 years ago, he couldn't have imagined he would do something similar. On the way, he threw away Ron's chair, the bloodied carpet, and the hammer. Then at the canyon, he used all the props to prepare the final scene of the accident. He doused the car with gasoline, prepared a propane tank, put the man's foot on the gas pedal, flicked his lighter. It was at that moment that the blood flowing from the car spilled onto the road and created a puddle. Jaime set fire to the SUV and rolled the car down. He noticed a packet. Cleaning up at home, he collected pieces of brain in a packet, and now it fell out of the car. Jaime threw it into the ditch, thinking the fire would destroy it. Then he ran to his car, waiting for him at the cliff, and wanted to drive to Texas, but he couldn't. He had to see her. When he entered the house, Patty was washing her husband's blood in the living room. And right where Ron had been killed a few hours earlier, Patty's 3-year-old granddaughter sat watching cartoons on TV. Patty flew into a rage when she saw him. Jaime asked to hug him goodbye. Patty reluctantly complied, and he finally left. On the way, alone with his thoughts, he began to realize what he had done. He felt very ashamed and sick. Jaime was supposed to go to Texas to be with his relatives, but when the police didn't believe in the accident and began investigating the murder, Patty became nervous. She ordered him to go somewhere they wouldn't find him. Her anxiety multiplied when a month later, Jaime told her he was returning to California. The investigators had traced him back to his grandmother, the woman who raised him and whom he obeyed unquestioningly. She told her grandson that he shouldn't behave as if he were guilty of something and returned to California to talk to the police. Jaime agreed, but on his way back, despite his grandmother's and the investigators' advice, he called Patty. Apparently, that's when Patty realized that he was becoming a problem, and it was time to abandon him to save herself. She listened to Jaime and replied that she had a plan that would allow them to spend the rest of their lives together. Wasn't this what he had always dreamed of? She wanted to make it seem as if Jaime had abducted her. He agreed, thinking they would leave together and lie low for a while. Patty ordered her lover to overturn all the furniture in her house and knock down the bathroom door to make the abduction look more realistic. But she didn't warn him that she would be hiding behind it with a magnum. And as soon as he broke the door, she shot. Once, twice, thrice. She hit his hand, leg, and clavicle area. Jaime was in shock, asking, "How could you do this?"
The woman calmly approached and pressed the gun to his head, but the gun didn't fire. While Jaime lay on the floor in blood, she went to another room, tried to fix the gun, but changed her mind and left. For some reason, Jaime decided to follow her. Even more unbelievably, Patty said to him, "Okay, let's go." And they left the state together. The next day, Jaime's car was spotted at a motel in Salt Lake City, and the couple was taken into custody. But Patty wasn't done yet. She still had one last hope to convince Jaime to take the blame. But how could she do that? Before the trial, Patty and Jaime were held in a small jail together, and the plumbing arrangement of the prison allowed Patty to once again get into the heart and soul of her young lover. If you simultaneously flush the water in the female and male toilets, you can talk as if you are in the same room. Most likely, Patty wasn't the first to discover this, but she cleverly took advantage of this peculiarity, persuading Jaime to stick to her version. Allegedly, at first, she also wished for her husband's death, but changed her mind, and then Jaime killed Ron and abducted her, trying to get rid of the only witness. Remarkably, Jaime was willing to go along with this for her sake. However, when the boy's lawyer learned about it, he intervened and shuffled the cards for Patty. He contacted the only person who could break the spell over the woman, Jaime's grandmother. The grandmother and the beloved aunts of the young man ordered him to tell the whole truth. In the interrogation room, the investigators witnessed the power Patty had over Jaime. Despite her confession and everything she had done, Jaime begged for the opportunity to see her. In June 2009, the preliminary hearing began. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Jaime was not the only one whom Patty had tried to persuade to commit murder. Her friend took the witness stand and told that Patty had asked her if she knew anyone who could go for this crime. But even stranger was that she once wanted to kill her ex-husband and then asked the ex-husband if he would kill Ron. On June 29, 2009, Jaime pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and agreed to testify against Patty. But he did not get such an opportunity. Just a couple of days before the start of the trial in February 2010, she also admitted guilt. She was sentenced to imprisonment from 42 years to life for Ron's murder and attempted murder of Jaime. Jaime was sentenced from 25 years to life. Just before starting his sentence, Jaime met with Ron's 2 daughters and told them that he was a wonderful person. He treated him kindly, and Jaime also managed to love him for the short time he knew him. Yet despite what his own eyes had seen, Jaime chose to believe Patty. She chose an impressionable, vulnerable boy who was not loved in childhood, got into his soul, and made him do what she needed. Toledo, Ohio, January 27, 1992. At midnight, a call came in to the local taxi company reporting that 3 unidentified individuals had attacked a taxi driver in the parking lot of the University of Toledo student housing. The caller also mentioned hearing gunshots. The call was redirected to the 911 rescue service, and from there to the University of Toledo officers. 2 colleagues, Joseph Green and Jeffrey Hodge, immediately headed to the specified location. It was quiet and peaceful there, the ground covered in snow, with no signs of the crime that had occurred. Neither the taxi, nor the driver, nor the assailants were noticeable. Nevertheless, the 2 colleagues decided to look around, to walk around the entire parking area. Lighting their way with flashlights, the 2 officers turned the corner of the building and saw the body. It was a girl, lying face down in the snow. The unusual position of her body stood out. Her hands were placed neatly at her sides, palms up. People don't usually fall like that. The victim was without a coat, her dark blue sweater pulled up, and her jeans and underwear pulled down, fully exposing the midsection of her body. And in those areas of exposed skin, bullet holes were visible. There was also a bullet wound on the back of her head. The most obvious assumption, considering the appearance of the girl's clothing, was that she had been attacked with the intent of sexual violence. The victim didn't have any documents with her, but on the same evening, her roommate reported her disappearance. The victim's name was Melissa Ann Herstrom. Melissa was a 19-year-old student at the University of Toledo, studying to become a nurse. Melissa stood out among other students. She was very beautiful, cheerful, with dark wavy hair and distinctive bright lipstick that emphasized her vivacity and zest for life. Melissa had no enemies, especially not ones who would wish her harm. She wanted to have children and believed she would be a wonderful mother. No one doubted this, knowing what a sincere and kind person she was. She had so much to offer to the world, but she was prevented from doing so in the most callous way. Meanwhile,
Detectives from the Toledo City Homicide Department were investigating the crime scene. Shell casings were scattered everywhere, and some bullets had passed through the victim's body and into the frozen ground, so the detectives decided to dig them up along with the soil. Interestingly, one of the casings appeared as if it had been split in half by something. Additionally, not far from the crime scene, officers found a set of keys in a trash bin, and notably, among them were keys to a Ford Taurus. Police discovered the Ford approximately a kilometer from the girl's murder site, in a parking lot. What was intriguing was that the crime scene, the trash bin where the keys were found, and the parking lot were 3 different points on the campus map, and the detectives had to connect these points into a cohesive whole. The coroner took Melissa's body to conduct an autopsy. The examination revealed that Melissa had been shot 14 times at close range with a 9mm handgun. She was shot in the back of the head, causing her to fall to the ground, with her hands likely tied behind her back. Then, the killer fired another 13 bullets, shooting her in the back and descending to her legs. It was an incredibly brutal murder, as such a number of bullets was completely excessive. The pathologist ruled out the possibility of sexual assault. There was not the slightest sign of violence. However, she was partially undressed. This means the killer either aimed to humiliate her or wanted to see the damage caused by bullets hitting her exposed body. There was no alcohol or drugs in her system. She was completely sober. Marks on her wrists indicated that at some point she was immobilized with something, resembling handcuff marks. The detectives had no choice but to ask themselves who would use handcuffs. Primarily, representatives of law enforcement, or someone pretending to be a policeman. It wouldn't be the first time a killer, pretending to be a policeman, stopped a victim's car and committed a crime. Handcuffs are a means of control, so their suspect is someone seeking complete control over their victims. The news of the murder of the student quickly spread throughout the university campus. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that shortly before the murder, an unknown individual began terrorizing one of the female dormitories. Someone opened fire in the building, firing 9 shots, which were later removed from the walls. Considering that these incidents occurred practically one after another, everyone assumed that they were connected, because such things had never happened before at the University of Toledo. Indeed, it was the first murder on campus in decades, and the students were horrified. Melissa's friends couldn't understand how this could happen, why, and who could have done it. Everyone loved her. It didn't make sense. There were 30 girls living in that dormitory, and they no longer felt safe. Someone called their parents, and they took them home. Melissa's friends were worried that they were in danger, but investigators believed that Melissa was the target because of the brutality of the crime, the 14 shots. When the killer kept shooting at a dead girl, it looked like a crime that could only happen in a fit of incredible rage. Detectives interviewed Melissa's friends about how she spent the evening of January 26th. It turned out that she met up with a friend from the university's women's club, sorority, after which she planned to return home. However, someone called her and informed her that her boyfriend, JR, was spending time with another girl. So Melissa went to the parking lot adjacent to where JR lived. From there, she would be able to see when he returned home and with whom. It was for this reason that the police's initial suspicion fell on her boyfriend. Jealousy and anger often become the motives behind many thoughtless acts, especially since the 14 bullets fired into the immobilized girl indicated the rage of the attacker. Melissa's boyfriend, JR, stated that he was indeed with another girl at his home that evening. He didn't see Melissa and had no idea that someone had informed her of his infidelity. However, things were not as simple as they seemed. Investigators found out that Melissa's personal life was more complicated than it appeared at first glance because she was hiding her new relationship from her ex-boyfriend, Kenny. Kenny was a very volatile person, the kind who gets into fights in bars, can punch a wall in anger, and yell threats in fits of rage. Naturally, the question arose of what Kenny would do if he found out about Melissa's new relationship. Thus, the police suddenly had 2 suspects, the unfaithful boyfriend and the aggressive ex-boyfriend. Both were invited for questioning. They answered questions candidly, sincerely wanting to help the investigation, passed polygraph tests, and had alibis, meaning neither of them had any connection to the crime. However, now that both guys had been ruled out as suspects and no new ones emerged, panic began to spread throughout the university campus. Everyone understood that it still could be a random murder, and fear gripped the University of Toledo. A pair of girls from the women's dormitory reported receiving strange, threatening calls. It was the same dormitory where the unknown assailant had fired shots. The girls were so terrified that university officers escorted them to and from their classes. Since no one suspected who the killer was or why he targeted Melissa, everyone wondered who would be next, fearing that the killer could emerge from around any corner at any moment. Despite this, everyone had to continue studying and working. The detectives, contemplating their next move, noticed similarities between Melissa's murder and recent victims of a serial killer. In Los Angeles, the killer, dubbed the Mountain Strangler by the police, had murdered 10 young women and left their bodies in the mountains along the highway. Sometimes serial killers pose as police officers because it's so easy to set up a flashing light for a car, stop the victim, abduct, and kill. However, this version seemed too far-fetched. Therefore, with no suspects and feeling the tension from the growing panic on campus, the investigators returned to square one. More precisely, it was the call to the taxi dispatch when the caller reported that robbers had attacked a taxi driver. Detectives investigating Melissa's case decided to trace the call and found out that it came from a campus service building, which was locked on weekends, meaning the caller must have had keys. What did this reveal to the investigators? It indicated that the killer had keys to the locked facility. Meanwhile, the victim's hands were likely bound with handcuffs, typically positioned behind the back as police are taught. Reluctantly, the investigators had to admit the obvious. It wasn't a serial killer posing as a police officer, but an actual police officer. Detectives decided to speak with Joseph Green and Jeffrey Hodge again, the two officers from the University of Toledo who found the body. Perhaps they had overlooked some evidence. In fact, both officers had very positive reputations. Joseph was a friendly young man who told silly jokes and was just a pleasant guy. Jeffrey Hodge was also a quiet, modest man who had recently gotten married. He loved his job, was a bit of a Boy Scout, always eager to help, and had previously worked as a 911 dispatcher. He was very eager to contribute to the investigation. Detectives decided to start by questioning Joseph Green because he was the one who found the body and wrote the report. On that day, around 7 o'clock in the evening, it was snowing heavily. The girl had left her friend's place before the snowfall, meaning when Melissa and her killer appeared at the crime scene, there was already snow, and there should have been footprints in the snow. However, according to Joseph Green's report, there were no shoe prints on the ground, only freshly fallen snow. This obvious discrepancy with the facts puzzled the detectives, because it was unclear why the police officers went to inspect the area at all, if the snow was untouched and there were no footprints leading there. Moreover, they were the ones who found Melissa's keys in the trash bin. What prompted them to look into the trash bin? There was something else that puzzled the investigators. Joseph said, "When I saw the body, I knew she was dead." The investigator was surprised and asked how that was possible. Joseph replied that his family owned a funeral business and he had seen many dead bodies. While these weren't incriminating pieces of evidence, the combined facts urged the investigators to dig deeper. Forensic investigators examined both officers' cars who were on duty that night. They were looking for physical evidence that could tie Melissa to one of the patrol cars. They couldn't find any fingerprints, but they discovered a green wool thread that matched the girl's coat. Additionally, they found a long hair on the seat. At that time, they couldn't conduct DNA comparison on the hair, but it matched the color of the victim's hair. These were more indirect pieces of evidence, but still significant. Officer Joseph wrote a report in which inconsistencies were noted. Now, with the evidence found, the hair and thread in the patrol car, the evidence against Officer Joseph Green began to accumulate one after another like a snowball. He became the main suspect in the investigation. Detectives kept an eye on him, showing up at his house in the middle of the night to collect discarded trash, trying to find something that could link him to the crime. Ultimately, detectives decided to polygraph all officers involved in the case. Joseph Green was the first to be tested, but his test came out clean. Therefore, they had to leave him alone. The only thing that continued to bother the police was his certainty about the absence of shoe prints. Usually, when a police officer sees someone in distress, they rush to them immediately, and that's probably what Green did. So he probably wasn't certain, but insisted on the absence of shoe prints, making detectives suspect him. With Joseph Green, his partner Jeffrey Hodge arrived. Nobody suspected him, but it was decided to polygraph everyone just in case. Before Melissa's body was found, and before Jeffrey started his night shift, he watched the Super Bowl with friends, including other officers. Jeffrey, for some reason, seemed nervous, asking about ballistics, how long a body can remain under certain conditions before decomposition, what it's like to see a body, essentially asking quite strange questions. He also turned on the homeowner's radio on the police frequency. Of course, friends asked him what he was doing, to which he replied that he just wants to know what's going on before going to work. Now, at the station, waiting for the results of his partner's check, he opened up to one of the detectives and mentioned how funny it was to watch the girls from the women's dormitory running out into the street in light, translucent clothing when the fire alarm went off. Such conversations were not illegal, but clearly inappropriate and unbecoming for a married officer tasked with protecting these girls, especially considering it was the same dormitory where the girls were suffering from strange calls and gunshots. Nevertheless, Jeffrey went to the polygraph examiner next. As part of the preparation, he was asked various questions, such as what he considered the best thing that happened in his life, to which he answered, working as a police officer. Jeffrey had worked as an operator for the rescue service and had tried to get into various police departments until he was finally hired by the university. And for his graduation, his grandfather gave him a pistol. The polygraph examiner casually asked which one, and he replied, Smith & Wesson, the same type of pistol from which the fatal bullets could have been fired. The polygraph examiner tensed up but didn't show it, remembering that Jeffrey Hodgson had been at the crime scene and knew how the victim was dressed, the position of the body, and the shell casings found. The polygraph examiner had to work somewhat unusually and formulate a variety of similar questions. For example, was the victim bound with a belt, stockings, wire, tape, handcuffs? And here the polygraph showed how Jeffrey Hodgson clearly reacted to handcuffs. That was enough to cast doubt on him. The detectives asked him to show the pistol given to him by his grandfather. The man agreed and said it was in the locker at the university. But there was no weapon there, and Jeffrey claimed that someone wanted to set him up, which was strange. If someone really wanted to set him up, the gun would have been there. Instead, Jeffrey's handcuffs were confiscated. They were taken to the laboratory and examined under a microscope. Traces of copper and lead, metals associated with bullets, were found on them. Considering that one bullet had fragmented upon impact with something hard, these could well have been the handcuffs. And on their inner rim, specialists found a tiny fragment of skin. However, extracting DNA from such a tiny fragment was not easy at that time and required time. Jeffrey was arrested on February 1, 1992, 6 days after Melissa's murder. After his arrest, it suddenly became clear that he didn't seem like a nice guy to everyone around him. Girls recounted how he would stop them on fabricated pretexts, claiming they were drunk. Ann Collins was stopped by Jeffrey almost a day before Melissa's murder. She parked her car in an almost empty parking lot, and he pulled up behind her, blocking her. She hadn't been drinking, so she didn't understand why he was asking her about it. Fortunately, the persistence of the young officer seemed strange to her, and she talked to him without getting out of the car, just opening the window slightly. Anne feared and imagined what could have happened if her boyfriend hadn't shown up, with whom they were supposed to have breakfast together. She's sure she would have been Jeffrey Hodgson's first victim. But when her boyfriend appeared, Jeffrey quickly got back into his car and just drove away. Unfortunately, the next evening, he stopped another girl, Melissa Hurstrom, without any reason. The students were horrified when they learned the name of the arrested man. After all, Jeffrey had escorted them to classes when they were scared, told them he was working on the case, and everything would be fine. In other words, he presented himself as a knight in shining armor, although they were actually afraid of him. The case against Hodgson was built on circumstantial evidence until 3 weeks after his arrest, when the DNA test results came in. The fragment of skin on his handcuffs belonged to Melissa Hurstrom. In 1993, 18 months after the murder, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to the murder in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole. He limited his admission to just that and claimed he didn't remember anything about the crime itself. It's unlikely that this is true. He probably remembers every little detail. But even without his confession, detectives had a version of what happened to Melissa that evening. Jeffrey Hodgson patrolled the area of the college campus. It wasn't his first time stopping pretty girls. Unfortunately, Melissa was alone on the street that evening. She wasn't drunk, but she was alone. She didn't have her driver's license with her, and instead of a warning or a fine, Jeffrey Hodgson forced her to get into his car and drove her to the dormitory, where she got her license. He convinced her to take off her coat and put it on the back seat of the car so he could get a better look at her body. He was supposed to take her back to her car, but during the ride, he began to harass her. Melissa didn't like it, and she probably told him that such behavior would cost him his job. Another person might have ignored this, but not Jeffrey Hodgson. A man who considered being a policeman the best thing that ever happened in his life didn't see himself in any other role. He drove the girl to a remote parking lot, pulled Melissa out of the car, frightened her, handcuffed her, and led her around the corner of the building. This is where he pulled down her clothes, humiliating her, and reached a point where he was horrified by what he had done and saw the only way out for himself in murder. And he shot the girl in the back of the head. Later, he called the dispatcher so he and his partner could answer the call and find the body. After all, he knew for sure that he had left footprints in the snow and needed an explanation of how they got there. He manipulated his partner, allowing him to find the body and write the report. Jeffrey Hodgson also confessed to making threatening calls and shooting at the dormitory.
He did this to once again respond to the call himself and appear a hero in the eyes of others. His cruelty quickly escalated, and it all ended with him killing a person. The former police captain, who headed the homicide department in 1992, said, in his opinion, Jeff Hodgson is a psychopath. It showed in how his crimes escalated. He believes if they hadn't caught him, he would have become a serial killer. He would have struck again. When he was formally dismissed in March 1992, representatives of the university found that he often stopped students, or rather female students, without informing the dispatcher. Once he called a girl's home several hours after arresting her for drunk driving, fabricated reports of robbery and an armed man on campus, as well as violated rules by waiting for students in bars outside the campus and following them to the student village, where he stopped them on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. It is believed that he made a call about a planned bombing against the university president and started fires, committing crimes that he himself investigated. He was not charged with other offenses investigated by the University of Toledo police. The prosecutor offered him a deal because the main evidence against him was DNA. They didn't even find his personal gun from which he fired at the dormitory and at Melissa. But if today all jurors know what DNA is and that it's practically a 100% guarantee that the accused is the real killer, in those years, DNA was new, just like a smeared fingerprint. The prosecutor was afraid that Jeffrey would be acquitted. At that time in Ohio, there was also no life sentence without the possibility of parole, as there is today. Therefore, he was sentenced to a term of 33 years to life, but considering the time he had already served in prison and his exemplary behavior, his first parole hearing was held on September 21, 2021. Melissa's family, her friends, and other people associated with the case, including Anna Collin, wrote letters to the parole board objecting to his release. About 400 letters were sent in total. When Jeffrey killed Melissa, he was only 22 years old. He was still relatively young and could commit more crimes if released. Furthermore, over the years, he never once contacted Melissa's family, never apologized, never attempted to explain what happened that night. Of course, his release was denied, and the next hearing will take place in 2031. The victim's family sued the university because the university administration hired Jeffrey and overlooked the numerous offenses he committed. The university paid the family $1 million, but it didn't make things easier for them. They never heard from Jeffrey Hodgson what Melissa did to deserve such a fate. Although more than 30 years have passed, Melissa's university friends have not forgotten about her. A few years ago, they raised funds to create a cozy relaxation area at the university, where students can sit, relax, and remember Melissa, who once also studied at the University of Toledo, dreaming of becoming a nurse. But this was not allowed for her by a 22-year-old policeman with too high an opinion of himself, dreaming of becoming a hero, and instead of that, killing a girl whom he pledged to protect.
What a fantastic vacation it was. For 2 weeks, the Lightham family enjoyed the joys of summer relaxation. They went fishing, water skiing, and swam in the cool, clear waters of Greenwood Lake. These 2 weeks in July 2011 were a true idyll, now only living in memories. The last day of that wonderful vacation, the final moments before. As the sun set, the spouses decided to take a boat ride. What they talked about, only they knew. But the consequences of their conversation would harm many, both those they knew and those they did not. This story begins with idle on the lake, but ends with an incredible intertwining of lives of entirely different people, answering the question, how low will a person fall from money, pride, the desire to win despite everything? Who could have thought that it all started with a blind date? Chris, a man of few words and calm demeanor, and Nancy, a cheerful and sociable woman, made a wonderful couple. They got married less than a year after their first date. Thanks to his wife's support, Chris became one of the most influential and successful bankers in the city, achieving dizzying career heights. Nancy worked in a real estate agency and became the treasurer of the State Lottery Commission. After 20 years of marriage, the couple mingled in the highest echelons of Charleston society. 2 wonderful daughters and a mansion in a prestigious neighborhood complemented the image of a happy family. But perfect marriages don't exist. Chris's successful career left him with less and less time for his family, and by their 22nd anniversary in March 2011, he decided to sleep in the guest room so that his snoring wouldn't disturb his wife's rest. Was it a warning sign from his side? Perhaps. But Nancy felt that her husband simply didn't harbor the same feelings towards her as before. This continued for 6 months until that night at the lake. The lake appeared as a black satin canvas against the backdrop of the setting sun. Chris and Nancy sat in the boat, and nobody dared to interrupt the prolonged silence. Then Chris turned to his wife and looked at her with a gaze she had never seen before. Cold, distant, determined. He declared that he wanted a divorce.
This statement thundered like a storm out of a clear sky. Nancy couldn't understand how one could so easily give up on 2 decades of marriage, but there was nothing to be done. They decided to divorce amicably, without scandals. Literally a few days later, the spouses celebrated Nancy's 45th birthday together at her favorite Japanese restaurant. Chris and Nancy agreed not to tell the girls about the divorce, and the evening went great, without a single sarcastic remark or unkind glance. When the waiter brought the bill, Chris asked him to take a picture for memory, a picture of the whole family. In the following 18 months, as the divorce process was underway, this picture was forgotten, until its fragment ended up in the most inappropriate hands of a person with murder behind them. Time passed. It was Thursday, April 4th, 2013. Officer Daniel Wilson was driving around Charleston, patrolling the streets, when he noticed something that caught his attention. A man leaned towards the passenger seat of a slowing car. Knowing this part of the city and considering the late hour, the officer realized that there was likely illicit substance trafficking going on. The dealer noticed the policeman and sped away. The driver also attempted to flee, but the officer followed him. The driver turned out to be a middle-aged man named Aaron Wilkinson. In the car with him were his wife and a dog. The man was friendly and admitted to having served time for fraud. But what alarmed the officer was Aaron's lack of a driver's license, and the car was rented under a different name. The absence of a license gave the officer the right to search the car. He found a gun and ammunition. All of this looked bad in the eyes of the law. Clearly understanding this, Aaron unexpectedly blurted out that he had been hired to kill someone, and he had a week to carry out the job. Throughout his service, the officer had heard some absurd stories, but this one he believed because Aaron knew too many details. Investigators took over at the station. Firstly, they asked about the target's family. Lytham, the man replied. The detectives knew this family. Respected members of society, a banker and a member of the State Lottery Commission. Now one of them was in danger. But who exactly? The man was questioned for several hours, repeatedly asked about the murder he claimed he was trying to prevent. It all started 6 days earlier in Kentucky. Aaron's friend, Sammy Janavane, asked him to go on an important errand together. Not right away, but he confessed to his friend that he was planning to kill someone. Aaron was shocked, but he knew Sammy wasn't joking. He already had one murder under his belt. He killed a man who was renting a room in his house, set the body on fire, and went to sleep. Sammy was asleep when his wife smelled smoke. The house burned down, and Sammy, his wife, and 3 children were left homeless. The court agreed that the murder was self-defense, but Sammy was convicted of arson. Sammy and Aaron became friends while serving time in prison. According to Aaron, he had no choice. Sammy had a volatile temper, and it was better to be friends than enemies. Despite his fear, Aaron told Sammy that he didn't want to be involved in the murder and tried to leave, but Sammy promised to give him $2,500 if he just went along. Aaron should have refused and just walked away, but $2,500. He was dependent on illicit substances. The men continued on together. In a small town near Charleston, they bought a prepaid phone to contact the contact person, and when they set off again, Aaron overheard part of the conversation. It was a woman. She booked a hotel room for the meeting, where she gave Sammy the money. $5,000 in cash on top of the $5,000 Sammy already received. And Aaron realized there would be at least another $20,000 after the job. And if it all looked like an unfortunate accident, much more. The job had to be completed within a week, because on Monday, the Letham's divorce process began, and one of the spouses shouldn't appear in court. The woman also gave Sammy an envelope with all the information that might be needed by the killers unfamiliar with the city. Aaron felt a growing sense of unease. Before, everything seemed a little unreal, but now, when he saw the photos, everything changed. He realized that an innocent person had to die, and he was obliged to prevent the crime. But how? Sammy was determined, and if Aaron made a mistake, not only he would suffer, but also his wife. As if on cue, Sammy's phone rang. It was his girlfriend. She accused him of cheating, and the young people had a terrible argument. Aaron saw an opportunity for himself. He persuaded Sammy to go home and make up with his girlfriend. Secretly, Aaron hoped that Sammy would completely abandon the idea of murder, but no. Sammy planned to deal with his girlfriend and immediately return to Charleston. Any other person would have called the police, forgotten about this night incident, but not Aaron. The thought occurred to him to convince Sammy that he would do everything himself. Strangely enough, Sammy agreed. Of course, it was just a trick. He took his wife and dog with him, in case Sammy suspected something, and planned to stay in the hotel until Monday, when the motive for murder disappeared. But they didn't plan to refuse illicit substances, and that's how they got caught. And now they were sitting in the police station, telling the police everything. Investigators didn't know whether to believe the words of a killer who confessed to a murder that hadn't happened yet. On the other hand, what did he have to gain by inventing such a story? Absolutely nothing. Yet the police couldn't act without evidence. But Aaron had it.
That envelope with all the information about the victim, left in the hotel room's number. The envelope turned out to be exactly where Aaron said, in his room on the bedside table. There were numerous pictures of the victim, pictures of Nancy Leatham, as well as a mass of personal information about the woman herself, her children, her car, her house. The author of the materials even indicated where the killer should better park the car to avoid suspicion. Nothing revealed the author of the materials, but investigators understood that Aaron hadn't lied. It was necessary to prevent the murder. FBI agents were brought into the case, who organized a phone conversation between Aaron and Sammy to catch the accomplice. Aaron was afraid and didn't want to do it, but he was persuaded. The conversation turned out to be impressive. Sammy not only talked about the weapon, but also gave approval for Aaron to deal with any accompanying victim who might stand in the way of Nancy Leatham, including the woman's younger daughter, who lived with her in the same house. This was enough to put Sammy under constant surveillance. They knew that the woman gave him the envelope, and she needed to be found. But before that, another woman needed to be found. Nancy Leatham had to know that someone wanted to kill her, and as soon as possible. What was Nancy doing during this time? 18 months have passed since that evening at the lake, when her husband expressed his desire for a divorce. During this time, she and her younger daughter rented a house several blocks away from the family mansion, which sat empty, awaiting a new family to move in. For a year and a half, she and her husband argued over money, property, and the blame for the divorce. But soon it will all be over. The divorce process was supposed to begin on Monday. Nancy's mind was preoccupied with the impending showdown in the courthouse, when there was a knock on her door. It turned out to be 2 federal agents. They stated that someone had hired a hitman to kill her and showed her the envelope found on the would-be assassin, Aaron Wilkinson. Horrified, Nancy looked at the details of her own life, where she parked her car, where she shopped, which route she preferred to drive, and so on. She sifted through the photographs until she came across a picture from the Japanese restaurant, the family's last photo. It was torn in half, and only her younger daughter and herself were left in the photo. Now Nancy had no doubt that all of this was the work of her husband. It even seemed to her that she recognized his handwriting. What she didn't understand was that he had put their younger daughter in danger. After all, her husband knew that, unlike her older sister, she lived with her mother. Was he really willing for his daughter to become a victim of the hitman he had hired? The agents had no doubt that Chris Leatham was involved in the conspiracy. What they didn't know was how the banker from Charleston had met the former convict from Kentucky. And who was the woman who handed him the envelope? Nancy couldn't understand why her marriage was falling apart. But her friends were convinced that there was something more behind Chris's desire for divorce than just cooled-off feelings. They persuaded Nancy to find out everything. The woman didn't know how to do it until one evening, when her husband rushed off to an urgent meeting and left his wallet on the table. The hesitation was brief. Inside, the woman found a label from potency pills. It was news to her that he was taking them, but it didn't end there. Her husband had a whole arsenal of such remedies, such as testosterone gel. If Nancy had suspected nothing before, she couldn't be stopped now. She knew her husband had a habit of recording all passwords. Finding the password for his phone, she learned that when her husband moved to sleep in the guest room, he spent whole days texting with some woman and only stopped during working hours. Nancy was sure his lover was working with him. Furthermore, the woman found out that her husband had registered on a dating site and was actively using it. This was enough to turn to a private detective, one of the 3 who had been working for her for several months. He confirmed that Chris was having an affair with a co-worker. If at first the spouses decided to part amicably, now there could be no talk of that. Nancy demanded that Chris leave the house. In turn, the man arranged for her dismissal and closed her credit cards. He handed Nancy a check and said that the next one she would receive would be only in January. It was mid-November. Nancy needed to pay for the house, gas, food, gifts for the children, and he left her with only $300. At that moment, the Leathams' divorce turned from loving to disgusting. It is important to delve deeper into the law of South Carolina. It punishes adultery, but not just any. The family's breadwinner, usually the man, doesn't have to pay alimony to his ex-wife if he can prove that she cheated on him. And it doesn't matter whether he cheated once, more than once, or more frequently. In the eyes of the law, only the wife's infidelity matters. That was the case in 2013, and that's the way things are even today. In other words, even if Chris Leatham admitted his infidelity, he lost nothing. However, Nancy knew how jealously he guarded his image. She knew he would be more likely to agree to her terms than to let his reputation be destroyed. Therefore, she continued to dig further. 6 months before the idea of a contract killing surfaced, Nancy learned that her husband's mistress, whom she had been tracking all this time, had been replaced. Chris Leatham was seeing another woman. Her name was Wendy Moore. At 39, she looked like a cover girl, a tall blonde with a snow-white smile and big blue eyes. She worked as Chris's assistant. Nancy first saw Wendy in the summer of 2012 when she gave testimony before the start of the divorce proceedings. The young woman claimed to have recently divorced, blaming Nancy for the divorce. Supposedly, her private investigator sniffed around and told her husband that she was having an affair with Chris Leatham. Nancy was shocked. In fact, she didn't even know Wendy's husband's name, but now she decided to meet him. The man's name was Matt, and he immediately admitted that he had lied about the conversation with the private detective. For months, his wife had been coming home and complaining about how tired she was of covering up the affair between her boss and another co-worker. And suddenly everything changed. She stopped complaining, started carefully choosing her clothes and hairstyle, and stayed late after work. Matt suspected a romance between Chris and Wendy and hoped the story about the detective would force his wife to confess. Matt decided to tell Nancy something else. 10 years ago, when Wendy still lived in Kentucky, she ran a private strip club at home, where according to Matt, clients could expect more than just a striptease. He and his wife and 3 children lived on the second floor of the house, while Wendy and a few other girls worked downstairs. Matt added that they supposedly even filmed unsuspecting clients. Wendy's husband Sam hired a security guard to handle noisy clients. This went on until one night when Sam argued with the guard, killed him, set fire to the body, and went to sleep, leaving the kitchen on fire. He was sleeping when Wendy smelled smoke and called the fire department. The court ruled the killing of the guard as self-defense, and a doctor explained the man's behavior as post-traumatic stress disorder, but he was still charged with arson. Sam went to jail, and Wendy divorced him, starting life anew. She raised the children and received a college education at home, which later allowed her to get a job at Chris Leatham's bank. Sensing a golden opportunity, Nancy decided to dig up everything she could about Wendy. She even contemplated going to Kentucky to track down her first husband, Sam Anavena, and only a few months later did she find out that the man she had been eager to meet was hunting her down in Charleston. The detectives didn't take much time to establish that Wendy was the one who delivered the package with photos and money to Sam and Aaron. She was arrested. Chris Leatham hired a lawyer for his mistress and didn't even bother to call his ex-wife to ask how she was feeling given that a killer was after her. Nancy and her daughters, along with 2 police officers, were living in a small rented apartment at the time. Her elder daughter was prohibited from attending college until the end of the year because she posed a danger to other students. Nancy hoped that following Aaron, Sam, and Wendy's arrests, Chris would also be arrested. But the prosecutor wasn't in a hurry, and their detention continued for several months. While Nancy and her daughters were in hiding, Chris continued to enjoy life, working at the bank and taking care of Wendy's children. A huge blow to the investigation came when, 2 months after Sam's arrest, he was found dead in his cell. He could have revealed a lot, could have named all the accomplices, but now the agents had to look for any other evidence of Chris Leatham's involvement. The most significant witness against Chris turned out to be Chris himself. He and Wendy spoke on the phone every day, and the police naturally recorded every conversation. It turned out they had developed a code word for Sam's lawyer, and Chris was the one paying for his services. In other words, he was paying the lawyer of the man who was supposed to kill his wife, the mother of his children. Furthermore, the detectives found out that 2 printers and Wendy's laptop unexpectedly disappeared from Chris's office. However, the bank where they worked was very strict about security. Information on the bank's server showed that someone from Wendy's computer was searching for photos and information related to Nancy, and then sent that same information to the printer. The same photos and maps were later found in the envelope of the hitman. Apple initially didn't cooperate, but eventually provided information from Chris's phone, which also yielded results. One of the key photos found in the envelope was taken with Chris's phone. This allowed them to tie him to the criminal conspiracy. 8 out of 11 pages in that envelope were linked to Chris's phone, computer, or printer. In other words, he was involved in the conspiracy at every stage. 4 months later, a warrant for his arrest was issued, but the agents didn't know where he was. They called Nancy. She speculated that he might be vacationing at Lake Jocassee. But where exactly? She promised to find out where he might be. Nancy asked her younger daughter to log into Facebook and asked to see the profiles of her father's best friend's children. One girl wrote, "We're at Lake Jocassee in a house for 14 people. There are 21 of us. How will we fit here?" The girl also mentioned that Wendy's children and other friends of Chris Leatham's children were there. A quick search on a search engine yielded a list of properties at Lake Jocassee available for rent. But only one cottage was designed for 14 people. Nancy called the owner of the house and got the address, which she was able to provide to the police. Her husband was arrested on her birthday. Nancy considered it the best gift she could receive. The trial began. Wendy and Chris were tried together, and they were careful not to incriminate each other in their own words. The most serious evidence was against Wendy. It was she who met with the perpetrators. She delivered the envelope, bought a prepaid phone for conversations with Sam, and finally, It was she who sent him money, signing a false name, a porn star's name. The case against Chris was built more on the fact that he had a romantic relationship with Wendy, but only he could provide personal information that ended up in the envelope. The lawyers tried to argue that he didn't lose anything in the divorce, but he wouldn't have paid alimony to Nancy unless he could prove her infidelity. Otherwise, with a salary of $650,000 a year, he would have been transferring $7,500 to Nancy for the rest of his life. Moreover, the divorce process reflected poorly on his reputation. Nancy disappeared, and so did all his problems. In the end, the jury found Wendy guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Chris was found guilty on only one of the 3 counts because not all the jurors believed that he had been involved in the conspiracy from the beginning. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. After all that happened, Nancy left South Carolina. In prison, Chris struck a deal, and she received most of the proceeds from the sale of their family property. Now she has a real job where she is highly valued. Nancy only met Aaron Wilkinson at the trial. She remembers how he found her face in the crowd and said with his lips, "Forgive me." This gesture seemed so sincere to Nancy that she had no doubt. She owed her life to him. She promised to speak at the trial to ask the judge to show leniency if he struck a deal, and testified against Chris and Wendy. She kept her word and spoke touchingly in his support. The judge sentenced him to the minimum term of imprisonment, 4 years. The last known information about Aaron is that he doesn't use banned substances and works in a drug rehabilitation center. He is married and raising 2 children. Chris and Wendy's unity fell apart during the appeal. Wendy claimed she was just following orders, obviously hinting that Chris was behind everything. Chris insisted that the hired assassination was fiction and the work of a sociopath. Who is he talking about? Wendy? Sam? Aaron? Be that as it may, Wendy's sentence was reduced because the court decided that 15 years was too harsh a punishment. Wendy was released in October 2021. Chris was released in January 2022. They spent just over 7 years in prison. After their release, they lead quiet lives, but not together. It is not exactly known who came up with the idea to get rid of Nancy Leatham. We will probably never find out. But one thing we know for sure, thanks to the suddenly awakened conscience of a drug-addicted criminal, this story is not a mystery of Nancy Leatham's murder.